Now, for more on the Belt and Road Forum, let's bring in Neysun Mahboubi. Neysun is a research scholar at the Center for the Study of Contemporary China at the University of Pennsylvania. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, Rachelle.
Now, let's start with a concern that keeps coming up, this debt trap. You see countries like Pakistan worried about their BRI, China-Pakistan economic corridor, that it might end up being trapped with heavy debts if their economy takes a turn for the worse. What are the main concerns surrounding BRI debt?
Well, so this phrase of debt trap diplomacy was coined by an Indian economist, and it's really kind of stuck. And you see it reflected in a lot of the rhetoric coming from Washington, especially criticizing the Belt and Road Initiative, but other countries as well. And the concern is basically that you're saddling developing countries with very limited financial resources with unsustainable debt that binds them to Beijing in a very sort of pernicious way. And I think the academic community at the moment, the consensus seems to be that there are some aspects of this critique that are valid, but it's also sometimes overstated, and it's not clear that it's always entirely fair in every instance.
Now, we did see Malaysia's Prime Minister once halted the railway project over debt concerns, but then renegotiated it with China and ended up cutting the project's costs by about a third. Are we likely to keep seeing these types of deal adjustments?
Sure, and that's a very good example. Malaysia and also Pakistan are often listed as very illustrative examples of problems that the BRI initiative has faced. But in both cases, there is a way of describing what's going on as simply renegotiating under better terms. In neither case have new leaders who have come into power and initially very critical of the former Belt and Road partnerships, have they completely withdrawn from those partnerships. They've simply renegotiated better deals.
And China is listening to those concerns. They're publishing a debt sustainability framework for the participating nations, and they're going to classify them as being low, medium, and high risk. What's your take on that latest move?
So my general take is that it's promising that the Chinese leadership seems to have heard this criticism, which does have some validity to it, and seems to be intent on addressing it, at least through rhetoric, and the next stage would be action. I think the bigger issue is not so much classifying countries in terms of medium, low, or high risk, but rather thinking about the quality of the investments, taking local perspectives into account, and generally enhancing the transparency and accountability of the investments. If Beijing were to make serious steps in those directions, I think at least the academic community would welcome them as very positive steps.
And they're also getting more input from a lot of these multinational organizations. We saw that the IMF's chief, Christine Lagarde, praised China's economic stimulus, but also warned against damaging the environment through unsustainable overseas investments. What's your take on this, and how is China addressing it?
Well, the line that the IMF or the World Bank might be trying to navigate here is, on the one hand, to praise China for putting resources into infrastructure development, which was neglected by the international monetary institutions for a long time in this part of the world. And so China does get credit for that, for sure. But then the nature of the projects, I think, could take environmental concerns and other concerns, including the debt trap concerns that we talked about earlier, more seriously into account. Now, China has established an institution called the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which is not particularly involved in Belt and Road Initiative projects so far, but it is a bank that does its lending in accord with the highest environmental standards as set by international institutions. And so one thing that people like me would be looking to see is whether Belt and Road investments start to follow the model that China has itself worked out in the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank.
And we know that obviously Europe is along that trade route, and Italy became the first G7 country to sign a memorandum of understanding for the BRI. Now, while this is expected to help Italy's stagnant economy, the EU was a lot more skeptical. What are the EU's biggest concerns?
So I think the EU as a large entity probably shares many of the concerns that the US holds, and some of those are specific to the details of Belt and Road, and some of those may have to do more with grand strategy and thinking about China's rise and accommodating China's rise on the world stage. But you see that particular nations, and Italy is a good example, they have particular needs that Chinese investment and infrastructure capacity could meet. And so, I don't know how it will turn out for Italy over the longer term, but it's very understandable that they would basically go their own way despite some negative signals coming from the EU in this regard.
And just very quickly, as we look at the African continent, China already invests widely there. And a lot of people are wondering, since there are already loans that the African countries may be renegotiating while also looking for new opportunities, do the rewards outweigh the risks of taking on more debt?
I think you really have to look at each country on its own terms. I think it's very hard to give generic answers in this respect. But one thing that I do want to also highlight is that we've been talking so far entirely about how partner countries or other international institutions think about these things. But a constituency that matters is also the Chinese public, and to what degree the Chinese public thinks that its money is being well spent in these areas is going to be important going forward.
All right, thank you so much. Neysun Mahboubi there from the Center for the Study of Contemporary China at the University of Pennsylvania.